Camping had always been one of my favorite ways to get away from everything. The noise, the stress, the constant distractions of life. Out in the woods, with nothing but a tent, a fire, and the quiet sounds of nature, it was easier to breathe. My fiancée and I had been going on camping trips together for years, and over time we had built up a rhythm. Setting up camp, cooking, relaxing under the stars. We knew how to handle ourselves out there. Last summer, we planned a weekend trip to Arkansas, choosing a spot that wasn't too remote but still far enough from the main roads to feel isolated. The campground was spread out, with plenty of space between sites and thick woods separating them. It was the kind of place where you might hear someone in the distance but never see them, where the sounds of crackling fires and faint laughter disappeared into the trees before they ever reached your tent. We arrived in the late afternoon, setting up camp at a site near a small creek. It was perfect, flat ground, plenty of shade, and a good spot for our tent not too far from the fire pit. The air was warm but not unbearable, the humidity hanging low over the trees. The scent of pine and damp earth mixed with the smoke from other campsites, drifting through the air in lazy tendrils. By early evening, we had settled in. The fire was going, the grill was heating up, and we were starting to cook. I was flipping burgers while my fiancée poked at the fire, occasionally tossing in small sticks to keep the flame steady. The sun was sinking behind the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. The sound of cicadas had started to rise, their constant drone filling the air. Then we heard it, a voice, distant but loud, cut through the background noise, sharp, urgent. A man's voice yelling. At first, I thought it was just someone goofing around. Maybe a group of campers getting a little too rowdy after a few beers. But then I caught the words. Help! I froze, burger still in hand. My fiancé's head snapped up, eyes narrowing in the direction of the voice. Came again, closer this time. Without thinking, I dropped what I was doing and ran. The sound had come from a few campsites over, just beyond the trees. My feet pounded against the dirt as I weaved through the brush, the undergrowth scraping against my legs. The smell of smoke and charred food faded, replaced by something sharper, metallic. Then I saw him, a man, standing near a picnic table, swaying slightly. His clothes were soaked in something dark, pooling at his feet in the dirt. For a split second, my brain refused to process it. Then I saw his leg. Blood poured from his ankle in thick, pulsing waves, pooling around his foot and seeping into his sock. It wasn't just a cut. It was gushing, spraying onto the ground in bright red streaks. His face was pale, his eyes glassy. My fiancée was right behind me, skidding to a stop as we took in the scene. I forced myself to move. Training from a first aid course years ago kicked in, apply pressure, elevate, stop the bleeding. My fiancée grabbed a towel from the man's table, pressing it hard against the wound, wrapping it as tightly as possible. Blood soaked through immediately. I turned and sprinted back to our campsite, nearly tripping over tree roots, my lungs burning. I grabbed my phone from the table, swiping at the screen with shaking hands. No service. I cursed, spinning in place. There was no time to wait for an ambulance, no way to even call for one. I ran back to the man, who was now sitting on the ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps. My fiancée had managed to slow the bleeding, but it wasn't enough. His foot twitched slightly, barely responding. I knew there was a hospital about 20 miles away, down winding back roads. A long drive in normal circumstances. Too long now. I made the decision before I could think too hard about it. I grabbed his truck keys from the picnic table, helped him to his feet as best as I could. He was heavy, leaning against me, his weight almost too much. We half-carried him to his truck, throwing open the passenger door. My fiancée climbed into the back seat, still holding pressure on his leg. I jumped behind the wheel, turned the key, and peeled out of the campsite, gravel kicking up behind us. The road was dark, winding, nothing but my high beams cutting through the night. My hands gripped the wheel so tight my knuckles ached. My heart was hammering, but I couldn't let myself think too hard about what was happening. The man groaned, his head tilting toward the window. His words were slurred, mumbled. Couldn't make them out. I pushed the truck faster. I wasn't good with blood. Never had been. Even small cuts made my stomach twist. But now there was no room for that. No time to think about the warmth soaking into the seat, the way it dripped onto the floor mats. My fiancé kept pressure on the wound, kept talking to him, though I barely registered the words. The road stretched on forever. The dashboard clock barely moved, each second stretching into an eternity. Then finally, lights. A dull glow in the distance. The hospital. I swerved into the parking lot, barely braking before throwing the truck into park. The moment the doors opened, the man slumped, his weight shifting. The floor mat beneath him was soaked, dark and sticky. The emergency room doors burst open as staff ran toward us. Hands pulled him from the truck, voices shouting orders, the world tilting sideways. I just stood there, my breath coming in sharp gasps, my hands slick on the steering wheel. Then, as the last of the staff rushed inside, the doors swinging closed behind them, I realized my legs were shaking. My stomach rolled, a wave of nausea hitting me hard. I barely made it to the bushes before I threw up. Minutes blurred together. My fiancé's hand found my back, grounding me. Eventually, we sat on the curb, waiting. The parking lot lights buzzed overhead, casting long shadows. An hour passed, maybe more. Then someone came out, telling us he would be okay. 18 stitches. That was all it took to fix something that had almost killed him. If we hadn't been there, if we had waited for an ambulance, he would have bled out. We drove back to camp in silence. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across our tent. The grill was still open, the half-cooked burgers untouched. We tried to salvage the night, sitting by the embers, staring at the flames. It didn't feel the same. At 10:30 p.m., the sound of footsteps on gravel made us both tense. It was him, limping but alive. He looked at us, nodded. No words were needed. We had saved his life, and neither of us would ever forget it. I had always loved camping. The stillness of the forest, the quiet of the night, the feeling of being alone but not lonely. There was something about it that made the rest of the world feel distant, unimportant. It was supposed to be simple, just a few days alone in the wild, away from everything. I had done it plenty of times before, but this trip was different. It started normally enough. I picked a remote area in a national forest, far from any roads or campsites. I wanted to be alone, away from other people. The drive out there was long, hours of winding roads through dense trees until I reached the trailhead. There were no other cars in the parking lot, which reassured me I had the place to myself. I checked my gear one last time before heading into the woods. My pack was heavy, loaded with everything I'd need. A tent, sleeping bag, extra food, a water filter, a first aid kit, a knife, a map, and a compass. I knew there wouldn't be any cell service, but I had marked my route carefully. I wasn't worried. The first few miles were easy. The trail was narrow but well-worn, cutting through towering trees and thick underbrush. The air smelled fresh, and the only sounds were my footsteps and the occasional rustling of animals in the bushes. I hiked for about 4 hours, deeper and deeper into the woods. The sun started sinking lower, and I found a spot near a small stream to set up camp. It was perfect, flat ground, plenty of firewood, and easy access to water. I set up my tent quickly and gathered wood for a fire. As the sun disappeared behind the trees, I sat by the flames, eating a simple meal and listening to the sounds of the forest. The quiet was peaceful, comforting. That night I slept well. I woke up once to the sound of something moving outside my tent, but it was distant, probably just an animal. I didn't think much of it and fell back asleep. The next morning, I decided to explore. I packed a small bag with water, a snack, and my knife, then set off into the woods. There was no real destination. I just wanted to see what was out there. The forest was thick, the trees stretching high, their branches blocking most of the sunlight. I followed a small game trail, pushing through dense underbrush, stepping over fallen logs. It was beautiful, untouched. And then I found something strange. It was an old campsite. The tent was still there, collapsed, covered in leaves and dirt. A rusted pot sat near a fire pit, long cold. A backpack lay torn open, its contents scattered. I stopped. There were no signs of recent activity. No footprints, no fresh firewood. No indication that anyone had been here in a long time. But it didn't look abandoned by choice. It looked like someone had left in a hurry. I took a step closer. There was a boot, half buried in the dirt. Just one. No sign of the other. A cold feeling crept over me. I turned and left, moving quickly, my earlier excitement gone. I made it back to my camp before sunset, but the unease didn't fade. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe someone had left in a hurry. Maybe they had an emergency. Maybe. That night, I didn't sleep as well. Every little sound made me tense up. The rustling in the bushes, the creak of the trees, the snap of a branch. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a different sound. Something was moving, close. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was careful, deliberate. I held my breath, leaves crunching, a slow, steady sound. It was coming from just outside my tent. I lay there, frozen, every muscle in my body tight. Then silence. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, waiting, listening. Nothing. Eventually, exhaustion won. I must have fallen asleep, because when I woke up, the sun was rising. I unzipped the tent and looked outside. Nothing. But then I saw it. The firewood I had stacked was scattered. Not knocked over. Not disturbed by an animal. Scattered. I packed up immediately. I moved fast, retracing my steps back to the trailhead. The forest that had felt peaceful before now felt different. The trees seemed taller, the shadows darker. I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind me, to see movement in the corner of my eye. I never did, but I felt watched the whole way back. When I reached the parking lot, my car was still there. The only car. I threw my pack in the back seat, locked the doors, and started the engine. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I don't know who or what was out there with me. I don't want to know. But I do know one thing. I'll never camp alone again. I spent a few summers working as a camp counselor at a sleepaway camp tucked deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. The kind of camp that had been around for decades, where the cabins were old, the trails were worn, and every counselor had a story about something weird that had happened over the years. It was the kind of place where the darkness felt heavier at night, where the trees swallowed the last bits of daylight and left everything feeling just a little too quiet. We always told ghost stories around the campfire. It was a tradition. The younger kids got the fun, silly ones, but the older campers wanted something scarier. Something that would stick with them when they lay in their bunks at night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the forest outside. I had my own go-to story, a tale about a ghost that killed people unless they gave him 2 of their teeth and 2 names of other people to take instead. It was the perfect mix of creepy and ridiculous, something that would make the campers uneasy but still let them laugh it off at the end. But the real trick, the thing that made it unforgettable, was what I did after. See, when I was a kid, 2 of my adult teeth never came in. I had gaps where they should have been, and for years I wore a retainer with 2 fake teeth to cover them. It was just one of those weird genetic things, nothing special, but it made for a perfect scare. At the end of the story, Right before sending the kids off to bed, I'd quietly pop the retainer out and give them a big, wide grin, showing the empty spaces in my mouth. That moment, the realization in their eyes, the way the fear flickered into something real, was the best part. It was all harmless fun. Until one summer, when something happened that I still can't explain. It was late July, the middle of the season. By then, the campers and counselors had settled into the rhythm of things. The newness had worn off, and we all felt comfortable, like we belonged there. The days were long and hot, filled with swimming, hiking, and endless games. The nights were cool, heavy with the scent of pine and campfire smoke. It was easy to forget the outside world existed. That night, my co-counselor and I had taken our group of campers down to the fire pit by the lake for stories. It was one of the last nights of the session, and we wanted to make it count. The fire crackled, reflecting off the water, and the kids huddled close together, wrapped in blankets and sweatshirts. The air buzzed with nervous energy, that perfect mix of excitement and unease that came with a good scary story. I told my usual one, drawing it out, letting the suspense build, watching their faces in the firelight. They hung on every word, eyes wide, breaths held. When I got to the end, when I told them about the ghost's demand for 2 teeth, I reached up and popped out my retainer. The reaction was immediate: gasps, shouts, a few kids scrambling back in pure, unfiltered terror. Perfect. We laughed it off, calmed them down, and sent them back to their cabins, still buzzing from the scare. My co-counselor and I stayed behind for a bit, letting the fire die down, enjoying the quiet. Eventually, we headed back to our own cabin, exhausted but satisfied. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. It wasn't unusual. Camp was full of noises, the wind through the trees, the occasional rustle of an animal moving in the brush. But this was different. I lay still, listening. The cabin was dark, the only light coming from the moon through the windows. My co-counselor was asleep in his bunk across the room, breathing slow and even. Everything was quiet. Then I heard it, a soft rustling just outside the cabin. Not the wind, not an animal. Something deliberate. I sat up slowly, my heart already pounding. The cabin door was closed, but the windows were open, letting in the cool night air. I strained my ears, trying to pick out the sound again. There it was, closer this time. A shuffling, almost hesitant, moving along the wall outside. I reached for my flashlight, gripping it tight. My mind raced through possibilities. One of the kids sneaking out? A prank from another counselor? I swung my legs over the side of the bunk, my feet hitting the wooden floor. The boards creaked softly under my weight. The sound outside stopped. I held my breath. For a long moment, there was nothing. Just the wind, the distant sound of the lake lapping against the shore. Then, slow and deliberate, something pressed against the window screen. Not hard, just enough to make it bulge inward slightly, like someone testing it. I flicked on the flashlight and aimed it at the window. Nothing. The screen was still, the woods beyond empty. My pulse hammered in my ears. I waited, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dark. A minute passed, then another. Finally, I let out a breath. Maybe it had been my imagination. Maybe I dreamed the whole thing. I turned off the light and lay back down, my body tense, my mind unwilling to relax. I stayed awake for a long time, listening. But the sound didn't come back. Morning came, bright and normal. The events of the night already fading into that strange, uncertain space between dream and memory. But when I stepped outside, stretching in the morning sun, I saw them. 2 small, white shapes, sitting just outside the cabin door. Teeth. I stared at them, my stomach dropping. They looked real, smooth, slightly yellowed, like they had been there for a long time. I bent down, hesitating before picking them up. They were cold. Too cold for something that had been outside all night. My mind struggled for an explanation. A prank? Some kind of coincidence? But who would do this? I looked around. The woods were the same as always, quiet and still. Nothing out of place. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I took the teeth and buried them near the fire pit, deep in the dirt, not sure why but feeling like I had to. I didn't mention it to anyone. What would I even say? The rest of the summer passed without incident. But I stopped telling that story, and I never, ever took out my retainer at camp again. I've been hiking solo for years. Something about being alone in the woods always felt right to me. The quiet, the fresh air, the feeling of moving through untouched nature without a schedule or responsibility. It cleared my head like nothing else could. That's why I took the trip. It was late September, just as summer was starting to fade into fall. The days were still warm, but the nights had that creeping cold that reminded you winter wasn't far away. Perfect hiking weather. I had planned for a 2-day trek, one night in the woods, nothing extreme. Just a break from normal life. The trail I picked wasn't popular. That was intentional. I didn't want crowds, didn't want families with screaming kids or loud groups blaring music from portable speakers. I wanted solitude. I found a place deep in the mountains, about a 3-hour drive from home. A long, winding dirt road led to the trailhead, and by the time I got there, my car was the only one in the small gravel parking lot. That was a good sign. I took my time checking my gear before heading in. Backpack loaded with food, water, tent, and emergency supplies. A map, a compass, a flashlight with extra batteries. I even had a satellite phone just in case. I wasn't careless. The first few miles were easy. The trail was well defined, though clearly not used often. Fallen leaves covered the dirt path, crunching under my boots as I walked. The forest was dense, but the sunlight filtered through in streaks, warm and golden. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. It was exactly what I needed. By midday, I had covered about 6 miles. I stopped near a creek, ate a protein bar, and drank some water while listening to the quiet sounds of the forest. No cars, no voices, just the rustling of leaves and the occasional distant call of a bird. I felt good. That feeling didn't last. After my break, I got back on the trail. The plan was to go another 4 or 5 miles before setting up camp for the night. The path started to get rougher. Not difficult, just less maintained. Fallen branches forced me to step carefully, and parts of the trail were narrow, with steep drop-offs to one side. That's when I saw the first sign that something was off. A boot print. It was old, partially washed out from rain, but it was there. Someone had been through here before me, which wasn't strange on its own. But what was strange was how deep it was. Like whoever left it had been carrying something heavy. I didn't think much of it at first, just something I noticed. I kept walking. The trees grew thicker, the sunlight dimming as the canopy closed in above me. The trail felt different now, more overgrown, less defined. I checked my map. I was still on the right path, at least I should have been. Then I saw the second footprint. This one was fresher, and it wasn't alone. There were several, all leading in the same direction I was going. But something was wrong with them. They weren't normal hiking steps. They were erratic, spaced unevenly, like someone had been stumbling or limping. A cold feeling settled in my gut. I told myself it didn't mean anything. Maybe someone had gotten tired, maybe they had a bad knee. There were 100 explanations, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept moving. The trail got worse. The further I went, the less it looked like a real hiking path. The trees grew closer, the underbrush thickening. I checked my map again. I should have reached a fork in the trail by now, a spot marked on the map where the path split. One route leading to a scenic overlook, the other continuing deeper into the forest. But there was no fork, just an unbroken stretch of trees in every direction. I stopped, took a deep breath. I had been following the trail. I hadn't gone off course. But now the trail wasn't there. I turned around. The path behind me was gone. That wasn't possible. I had just come from there. But when I looked back, all I saw were trees, thick and unbroken. The footprints, mine included, were gone. I stood there for a long time, heart hammering, trying to make sense of it. The air felt heavier. The forest was silent.
No birds.
No wind. Then I heard it. A sound. Faint, distant, like something moving through the trees. Not an animal. Something bigger. I turned in slow circles, scanning the forest. Nothing. Just trees, stretching in every direction. I wasn't alone. I forced myself to stay calm. Took out my compass. The needle spun uselessly, refusing to settle. That shouldn't have been possible. I pulled out my map, but it felt pointless. None of the landmarks matched what I was seeing. The landscape around me was different from what had been marked. I wasn't lost. Something else was wrong. I picked a direction and started walking. I needed to find anything familiar, a landmark, a clearing, even just a way out of the thick trees. I kept my breathing steady, moving carefully, trying not to panic. Then I saw it. A structure. Not a house, not a cabin. Something smaller. A metal cage. It sat in a small clearing, rusted and old. Too big for an animal trap, too small for a proper holding cell. The bars were bent in places, the door hanging open. And inside, something lay crumpled on the ground. Bones. A mix of animal and human. I stared at it, stomach twisting. Then, behind me, I heard movement. Slow. Deliberate. I didn't turn around. I walked. Then I walked faster. Then I ran. Branches tore at my arms. Roots tried to trip me, but I didn't stop. I ran until my lungs burned, until I thought I was going to collapse. Then suddenly I was back at the trailhead. I don't remember how I got there. One moment, I was deep in the woods, running from something I never saw. The next, I was standing beside my car, gasping for breath, covered in scratches and dirt. I didn't question it. I just got in my car and drove. I never went back. Some places aren't meant to be found. I always preferred solo camping over group trips. I liked the silence, the solitude, the feeling of being completely cut off from the rest of the world. No schedules, no distractions, just me, my gear, and the woods. This trip was no different. I had planned it for months, choosing a remote spot deep in the wilderness of Washington state. It was far from any official campsites, a place I found on an old topo map. A valley nestled between steep ridges, with a river running through the middle. The nearest road was over 10 miles away, and even that was nothing more than an unmaintained Forest Service road. It was exactly the kind of place I liked. Isolated, untouched, quiet. I started the hike early in the morning. The first few miles were on a faint, overgrown trail, but eventually I had to rely on my map and compass to navigate. The forest was thick, dense with towering evergreens and tangled underbrush. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. Birds called out from the trees, and somewhere in the distance, I heard the steady rush of water. By the time I reached the valley, the sun was already dipping low. The river was just as I'd imagined it. Clear, fast-moving, lined with smooth rocks. I found a flat spot on the bank and started setting up camp. First, the tent, then the fire pit. I gathered wood, stacked it neatly, and got a small fire going as the last light faded from the sky. The heat felt good against the evening chill. I cooked a quick meal, ate while staring into the flames, and let my mind settle into the rhythm of the woods. As the fire crackled, I started to get that feeling. The one I always ignored at first. The prickling at the back of my neck. The sense of being watched. It was common when camping alone, just a natural reaction to being so exposed. My brain playing tricks on me, filling the silence with imagined threats. I brushed it off and focused on the fire. The woods around me were quiet, just the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Nothing unusual. But then I heard something, a soft crunch. Not close but not far either. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight. A footstep. I froze, my heart hammering. I listened. Silence. Could have been anything. A deer, a raccoon, even just a branch falling. I waited, every muscle tensed. Nothing else moved. Eventually, I let out a slow breath and stood up. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it across the trees. The beam flickered over trunks, branches, undergrowth. Nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I stayed up longer than I had planned, letting the fire burn low before finally forcing myself into the tent. I lay there in my sleeping bag, staring at the nylon ceiling, listening. Every sound felt magnified, the river, the wind, the distant call of an owl. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was alone out here. At some point, exhaustion won. I drifted off. I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first, just that something was wrong. I listened. The fire was out, the night deep and black. The river was still rushing, the wind still whispering through the trees. Then I heard it, a sound close to my tent. Soft, careful, a footstep. My body went rigid. I reached for my flashlight with slow, deliberate movements. My fingers wrapped around it, my thumb pressing against the switch. I waited. Another step, closer this time. I clicked the light on. The beam shot through the darkness, illuminating the thin fabric of my tent. Shadows shifted. Something moved just outside. I barely breathed. The shape didn't move for several seconds. Then slowly it backed away. I stayed frozen, listening as the footsteps retreated into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. As soon as the sky started to lighten, I packed up. My hands were shaking as I rolled up my sleeping bag, shoved my gear into my pack. I wanted to be gone before whoever or whatever was out there came back. As I was taking down my tent, I saw them. Footprints. Not boots. Not animal tracks. Bare feet. They circled my campsite, stopped just outside my tent. I hiked out fast. Didn't stop. Didn't look back. Took me almost the entire day to reach my truck. When I finally saw it, sitting there on the empty dirt road, relief washed over me so hard I almost dropped to my knees. I threw my pack in the back, climbed in, and locked the doors. Then, just as I was about to start the engine, I saw something in the trees. A figure, standing just at the edge of the forest, half hidden in the shadows. Watching. I didn't wait. I started the truck, tore down that road faster than I ever had in my life. I never went back to that valley. I never even told anyone about what happened. But I stopped camping alone after that. I had been planning this hike for months. Ever since I saw a post about the remote backcountry trails in Montana, I knew I had to go. The pictures showed vast, untouched wilderness, dense forests, jagged peaks, and long, winding rivers cutting through the valleys. It looked perfect, the kind of place you could go for days without seeing another person. That was exactly what I wanted. No cell service, no noise, no people. Just me, my pack, and the trail. I picked a route that wasn't well traveled. It was about 30 miles out and back, cutting through thick pine forests, over high ridges and past deep, isolated lakes. The elevation gain was brutal, but I was ready for it. I had all my gear, tent, sleeping bag, bear spray, enough food for 5 days. Everything was set. I drove out early, the sun barely up, the roads empty. By the time I reached the trailhead, there was only one other car in the lot, an old truck with faded paint and mud caked on the tires. I didn't think much of it. Probably another hiker already out on the trail. I checked my pack one last time, tightened the straps, and started walking. The first few miles were easy, just a slow climb through dense forest. The air was cool, the smell of pine thick. The trail was narrow, winding between massive trees, the ground soft with fallen needles. Birds called from the branches, and now and then, I'd hear the rustle of something moving in the undergrowth. A squirrel, maybe a deer. After about an hour, I reached the first real climb. The trail turned steep, the dirt loose beneath my boots. I leaned forward, using my trekking poles to push myself up. My breathing grew heavy, sweat starting to build under my pack. I stopped once to take a sip of water, looking back down at the forest below. The trees stretched out endlessly, dark green and unbroken. No roads, no buildings, just wilderness. I kept moving. By mid-afternoon, I reached a small clearing at the top of a ridge. It was the perfect place to rest. Flat ground, a clear view of the valley below. I dropped my pack and sat down, stretching out my legs. I took a deep breath, enjoying the silence. That's when I noticed something. At the far end of the clearing, near the treeline, was an old fire ring. Just a circle of blackened stones, half covered in dirt and moss. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. But next to it, half buried in the grass, was something else. A boot. It was old, the leather cracked and faded, the laces missing. I walked over and picked it up. Inside, the insole was worn down to nothing, the toe caked with dried mud. Someone had left it here a long time ago. I looked around, but there was nothing else. No pack, no other gear, just the boot. I tossed it back down and headed out. The trail dropped steeply after that, winding down into a deep valley. The trees grew thicker, the air damp and cool. I passed a stream, the water clear and fast-moving, then started the next climb. It was slow going, my legs already tired, but I pushed through. I wanted to reach the lake before dark. It was just after 6 when I finally saw the water through the trees. The lake was small, maybe 100 yards across, surrounded by thick forest. The surface was perfectly still, reflecting the sky. I found a flat patch of ground near the shore and set up my tent. After eating, I sat by the water, watching the last light fade behind the trees. The air was still, the forest silent. No wind, no birds, nothing. Just the occasional ripple on the water's surface. That's when I saw the footprints. They were faint, just a few depressions in the dirt near the water's edge. But they were fresh, too fresh. I stood up, my skin prickling. The prints were barefoot. Whoever left them hadn't been wearing shoes. And they weren't mine. I scanned the trees, but saw nothing. The forest was just a wall of darkness. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal had come down for a drink. Maybe I was just seeing things. I went back to my tent, zipped myself in, and tried to sleep. I woke up sometime after midnight. At first, I didn't know why. Then I heard it. A sound, faint but unmistakable. Breathing. Slow, steady breathing. Just outside my tent. I lay completely still, my heart pounding. The sound was close, too close. Then, after what felt like forever, it stopped. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening. When morning finally came, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The forest was empty.
No footprints.
No sign that anyone had been there. But my bear spray was gone. I packed up fast. My whole body was on edge. Every rustle in the trees made me flinch. I needed to get out. I moved quickly, barely stopping for water. The whole way back, I felt it. That prickling sensation on my skin like I was being watched. When I finally reached the trailhead, my car was the only one there. But the old truck was gone. And nailed to a tree near the lot was something I hadn't seen before. A boot, the same one I had found on the ridge. I had always preferred hiking alone. There was something about being out there, deep in the woods with no one around, that made me feel like I had stepped outside of the world for a while. I liked the silence, the feeling of being totally untethered from the rest of my life.
No sedulis, no conversations, no expectations.
Just me, the trail, and the sound of my own footsteps. That's how I ended up hiking a remote trail in Montana late one afternoon, pushing further into the wilderness than I probably should have. I had been on a road trip for a few weeks, moving through the northern states, camping out when I could, staying in cheap motels when I couldn't. I had spent most of my time on well-traveled trails, places where I could pass other hikers every so often and feel like I wasn't completely alone. But that morning, I had stopped at a small gas station on the edge of a town I barely remember the name of, and the guy behind the counter told me about a trail a few miles out. No one really goes up that way, he had said. Not because it's dangerous, just kind of out of the way. That was exactly what I wanted to hear. So I drove out there, found the unmarked dirt lot he had mentioned, and set off into the woods with my pack strapped tight to my shoulders. It was perfect at first. The trail was well maintained but clearly not heavily used. The trees were thick, towering overhead, their branches swaying gently in the wind. I could hear birds, the distant rush of a stream somewhere off to the right. Felt like I had stepped into another world. I should have turned back before it got dark. I had planned to hike out about 4 miles, then loop back before the sun set. But the trail was beautiful, and I kept pushing forward, telling myself I would turn around just after the next bend, then just after the next clearing. Before I knew it, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees, and I was farther from my car than I had meant to be. I wasn't worried yet. I had my flashlight, extra water, and a small knife clipped to my belt. I had hiked alone plenty of times before, even in low light. I knew what I was doing. At least I thought I did. I was about 2 miles from my car when I first noticed the silence. Not just quiet, the total suffocating absence of sound. The birds had stopped. The wind had died. Even the distant rush of the stream was gone. I stopped walking. The woods felt heavy, like they were pressing in around me. I held my breath, listening hard, trying to pick up anything. An insect buzzing, a branch creaking, my own heartbeat. Nothing. That was the first time I felt it. That slow, creeping awareness that something wasn't right. I turned my flashlight on, sweeping the beam across the trees. Everything looked the same as it had before. Just woods, just the trail, just me. But the silence lingered. I started walking again, a little faster now, my boots crunching against the dirt. It was the only sound in the world. And then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the forest came back to life. A bird chirped. A breeze rustled the leaves. The distant stream was there again, whispering through the trees. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Just my imagination, I told myself. Just my mind playing tricks on me. But I picked up my pace anyway. About a mile from my car, I saw the first footprint. It was right there in the dirt, just off the side of the trail. Deep, clear, recent. It wasn't mine. I stopped, shining my flashlight over it, my stomach twisting. It was a boot print, same as mine, but bigger, wider, and it was pointing perpendicular to the trail, as if someone had stepped out of the woods, paused, then stepped back in. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees. Nothing. I kept walking. The second footprint was even fresher. This one was right in the middle of the trail. My throat went dry. I hadn't seen anyone else out here. No one had passed me. No one should have been this deep in the woods at this hour. I swept my flashlight along the ground, looking for more prints. There were none. Just that single boot print pressed firm into the dirt. I took a step back, my body tense. My heart was beating too fast now. Then I heard it, the snap of a branch, somewhere off to my left. I swung my flashlight in that direction, my pulse hammering. The trees stood still, thick and unmoving. I waited, ears straining. Nothing. After a long moment, I forced myself to keep moving, my legs stiff, my breath tight in my chest. I was almost to the car. I just needed to get there. The last stretch of trail felt endless. I kept my flashlight low, sweeping the beam along the ground, watching for more footprints, for movement, for anything. The silence had returned, thick and absolute. Then, finally, I saw it, the dark shape of my car sitting in the dirt lot up ahead. Relief flooded me. I was almost there. And then, just as I stepped off the trail, I caught one last thing in the flashlight beam. Another boot print. This one was different. It was facing mine, like someone had been standing there, waiting, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't look around. I walked straight to my car, yanked the door open, and got inside, locking the doors the second I was in. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, my headlights flooding the empty lot. Empty, but I didn't wait. I pulled out fast, my tires kicking up dust, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. I didn't breathe properly until I was miles away. I don't know what happened out there. I don't know who made those footprints. Maybe it was just another hiker, though that seems unlikely. No one parks at that trailhead. No one hikes out there. It's too isolated, too empty. I keep thinking about that last footprint, the one facing mine, like someone had been standing there, waiting, and I wonder how long had they been out there, and how close had they gotten without me knowing. I was running a long haul from Montana down to Texas, a good-paying load of steel beams headed for a construction site outside of Dallas. The trip was mostly open highway, cutting through Wyoming, Colorado, and into New Mexico before hitting the long stretch of Texas roads. I had done this route before, knew most of the truck stops along the way, knew which places had the best fuel prices, which rest areas were decent, and which ones to avoid. It was a straight run, nothing complicated. The truck was handling well, my trailer was balanced, and the weight was sitting right on the axles. My only concern was making good time so I could get ahead of a storm system I had been hearing about on the radio. Big rain coming out of the northwest, moving fast, threatening to dump water all the way down into New Mexico. I didn't want to be stuck hauling heavy steel on wet roads, so I planned to push through as far as I could before stopping for the night. I had left early that morning, fueled up outside of Billings, and made it past Cheyenne before sunset. The air was cooling down, the roads mostly empty except for a few other truckers running their own routes. It was one of those stretches of highway where you could drive for hours without seeing much of anything. Just road, dry grass, and the occasional gas station that looked like it hadn't been updated in 30 years. Around 9 at night, I passed a small roadside motel with a diner attached to it. I thought about stopping, maybe grabbing a coffee, but I wasn't tired yet. I figured I'd keep going, maybe make it into Colorado before taking a break. I had plenty of fuel, my logbook was clean, and I was making good time. That was when I saw the first sign. It was one of those old-fashioned wooden signs, half-rotted, sitting just off the highway. The kind of thing you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. My headlights caught the faded lettering as I rolled past. I didn't think much of it at first. Plenty of old rest stops along these highways, some maintained, some not. I had used them before when I needed a quick stretch, though I preferred truck stops with other rigs around. Safer that way, but 2 miles wasn't far, and I was starting to feel that ache in my back from sitting too long. I figured I'd pull in, stretch my legs, maybe use the bathroom if it was clean enough. A few minutes later, I saw the turnoff. A narrow road, barely wide enough for a big rig, leading off the highway into the darkness. The sign was old, rusted, barely standing, but the words were still visible. I signaled, eased onto the exit, and followed the road. The pavement turned to gravel almost immediately. My tires crunched over the loose stone as I rolled forward, my headlights cutting through the darkness. There were no lights, no other vehicles, just trees on either side closing in tight. I slowed down. The place should have had at least some lighting. Even the worst rest stops usually had a few old street lamps, maybe a vending machine glowing in the dark. But this place was dead quiet. I kept going. Then I saw it. A small parking lot, cracked pavement, weeds pushing up through the cracks. An old brick building sat at the far end, the kind of structure that might have been nice 40 years ago but had been left to rot. A few picnic tables sat off to the side, their wood warped and splintered.
No lights.
No cars. I pulled into the lot, letting my rig roll to a stop. I kept the engine running. Something felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I knew it the second I stopped moving. The way the air felt too still, the way the trees seemed to press in closer than they should. I glanced around, checking my mirrors. Nothing. Just empty space, darkness beyond the reach of my headlights. I was about to put the truck back in gear, forget about stretching, and get back on the highway. Then I noticed something. The bathroom door was open. Not wide open, just cracked. Just enough to see the dark space inside. It hadn't been open when I pulled in. I stared at it for a second, my hands tightening on the wheel. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe it had been open the whole time, and I just hadn't noticed. But I had a feeling, deep in my gut, that I wasn't alone. I put my truck in gear. That was when I saw the footprints. They were faint, barely visible in the gravel. But they were there, leading from the bathroom to where I had stopped. Not away, toward. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I hit the gas, my tires kicking up dust as I swung the rig around and aimed for the road. The gravel slid under my tires, the trailer rocking slightly as I forced the truck back onto the exit ramp. I checked my mirrors one last time. The bathroom door was closed. I never saw it move. I never stopped at a rest stop like that again. Camping alone had always been my thing. I wasn't antisocial, I just liked the quiet. The kind of silence you only get when you're deep in the woods, away from everything. No traffic, no distant hum of the city, no people. Just the sound of the wind moving through the trees and the occasional rustle of an animal in the underbrush. That was real peace. I had done solo trips for years, always looking for more isolated spots. The further, the better. This time, I had picked a place deep in the backwoods, miles from any official campsite. I found it on an old map. No marked trails, no roads leading directly to it, just a patch of forest with a small, unnamed lake in the center. Perfect. I packed light but smart. Tent, sleeping bag, extra layers, enough food for 3 days, a water filter, knife, first aid kit. I didn't like carrying a lot of weight, but I never cut corners on the essentials. I set out early in the morning, driving for hours down a mix of paved roads, dirt paths, and eventually, nothing but overgrown trails barely wide enough for my truck. By noon, I reached the point where I had to continue on foot. I parked in a small clearing, locked up, slung my pack over my shoulders, and started walking. The first few miles were easy, just following an old logging road that had long been swallowed by the forest. The trees were thick, mostly pines, their needles soft underfoot. The air was crisp, clean. I moved at a steady pace, adjusting my pack every now and then. The weight sat evenly across my shoulders, nothing digging in. A few hours in, the path faded completely, turning into raw forest. No more signs of human activity. I liked that. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. Birds chirped in the distance, but even their calls felt distant. The wind barely reached this deep into the trees, making everything feel still. After another hour, I reached the lake. It was exactly as I had imagined. Small, untouched, surrounded by thick trees. The water was dark, reflecting the sky. No signs of people. No trash, no footprints. I found a spot near the edge, slightly elevated so I wouldn't wake up in a puddle if it rained. I dropped my pack, stretched, and got to work setting up camp. The tent went up quickly, staked down tight. I cleared a small fire pit, ringed it with stones, and gathered enough wood to last the night. By the time I was done, the sun was starting to lower. The light filtering through the trees turned gold, casting long shadows across the ground. I built a fire, cooked a quick meal, and sat back, watching the flames. It was peaceful, but as the night deepened, I started to feel off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, just a slight unease. The air felt heavier, the silence deeper. I tried to brush it off. It wasn't unusual to feel a little on edge the first night alone. It was probably just my brain adjusting to the quiet. I stoked the fire, let the warmth settle into my skin, and eventually climbed into my tent. I laid there listening. The wind had completely died. Even the insects had gone quiet. I forced myself to close my eyes. Eventually, I drifted off. I woke early, stiff from the cold. The fire had burned down to nothing but embers. I stretched, boiled water for coffee, and ate a small breakfast. The lake was perfectly still, like glass. No ripples, no movement. I planned to spend the day exploring. I packed light, just my knife, water, and some snacks, and started walking. The forest around the lake was thick, the trees packed tight. The ground was uneven, covered in fallen branches and patches of thick underbrush. About an hour in, I came across something strange. A small clearing, empty except for an old fire pit. Just a ring of stones, half buried under leaves. Someone had camped here before. I crouched, running my fingers over the stones. They were cold, undisturbed. It had been a long time since anyone used this spot. Still, something about it made me uneasy. I stood, scanning the trees. Nothing. The silence pressed in, heavier than before. I turned back, moving a little faster than I had on the way in. When I reached camp, I felt better. The fire was still smoldering, my gear untouched. I forced myself to relax. The rest of the day passed slowly. I fished for a bit, caught nothing. As the sun dipped lower, the unease returned. The air grew thick, the silence even heavier than the night before. I built the fire higher, letting the flames push back the darkness. I ate quickly, feeling more on edge than I wanted to admit. Then I heard it, a soft rustling, somewhere beyond the firelight. I froze, my pulse hammering. It wasn't the wind. There was no wind. I scanned the darkness, straining my ears. Nothing. I forced myself to stay calm. It was probably an animal. A deer, maybe, but I kept my knife close, just in case. That night, I barely slept. I woke up feeling groggy, my body sore. The fire had burned low again, and the air was colder than before. I stepped outside, stretched, then stopped. My firewood was gone. Not scattered, not chewed up by animals, just gone. A tight knot formed in my stomach. I scanned the ground. No footprints, no signs of movement. I told myself I must have miscounted how much I had left. I didn't believe it. I packed up as fast as I ever had. I wasn't staying another night. The hike back felt longer. The woods felt different. The whole time, I felt like I was being watched. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow made my skin crawl. I kept checking over my shoulder, expecting to see something, but I never did. By the time I reached my truck, my hands were shaking. I threw my pack in the back, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For just a second, I thought I saw movement in the trees. A figure, standing still, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't look again. I just drove. I don't know who was out there. I don't know how long they had been watching me, but I haven't camped alone since, and I never will again.